Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 71, Guinea Pigs. When Wu Yijun burst out laughing, Liang Peng finally started laughing while looking at Chen He as if he was an idiot. Eventually, after being dumbfounded for a moment, the handsome young archer finally understood that his other childhood friend had played a bad joke on him. Since Wu Yijun knew perfectly well that Chen He saw Bai Zemin as a potential enemy for the affection of his childhood crush, but she said such words to tease him, it was obvious what her intentions were. Yijun Yu. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry as he secretly looked at Shangguan Bingshui. Unfortunately, he was only disappointed to notice that her expression was as cold and indifferent as ever. She looked at the scene with a hard-to-read expression and secretly shook her head. Shangguan Bingshui knew that Wu Yijun was a person who, when the atmosphere was bad, liked to joke to ease the tension. Even so, the joke was indeed a bit awkward. Is there any change with the test subject who ingested the flesh of the First Order beetle? Shangguan Bingshui asked, not dwelling on the matter from before and immediately forgetting about it. For now, there is no change at all. Wu Yijun's face finally became serious, and she looked towards the small enclosed room as she said, "It's already been 4 hours, but there hasn't even been any change in those people. Do you want to wait more time just in case, Bingshui?" Shangguan Bingshui nodded and said indifferently, "That's right. Let's wait until nightfall, and if there are no negative changes, then we'll let them go right away as promised." Liang Peng looked at Shangguan Bingshui and could not help but secretly shudder as he realized that under that cold and indifferent face was actually a cruel woman. The test subject she was talking about was actually 3 of Qiao Long's lackeys who had also abused other people by making use of their position as bootlickers. However, after Qiao Long was defeated and killed by Bai Zemin's group, those 3 lackeys became prisoners of war. Although Shangguan Bingshui wanted to kill them all, she was a pretty smart woman capable of seeing the big picture of the world. Therefore, after deliberating with herself, she came up with the idea of using these people as guinea pigs to test the flesh of the First Order elephant beetle and see if any kind of mutation or malformation happened in any of the 3 subjects. Shangguan Bingshui's idea was approved by Bai Zemin and Liang Peng without hesitation, and although Chen He still felt it was not right, he finally agreed. When they told the 3 male students that they had abused of Qiao Long's power, naturally none of them agreed to become guinea pigs and taste the beetle's flesh. After all, who in their right mind would be willing to eat something that could kill them or turn them into some kind of weird creature? Unfortunately for the 3 guys, none of them had too many options to choose from as Bai Zemin threatened to throw them alive into the zombies if they didn't want to do the job. Seizing the opportunity, Shangguan Bingshui had promised that as long as nothing bad happened to them, she would let them go and no one would stop them. Under the cold stare of Bai Zemin, who did not seem to be lying when he said he would throw them into the zombies just as he had done before with Qiao Long, and under the allied hand extended by Shangguan Bingshui, the 3 male students obediently became guinea pigs. However, Liang Peng did not expect that she would still be so cunning and cruel. If she released them at night when the danger multiplied infinitely, the already slim chances of survival that the 3 test subjects had in case they passed the project would plummet even further. Seeing her cold and indifferent expression remain unchanged, Liang Peng finally realized that the woman in front of him had never intended to let those 3 men live from the beginning. Bai Zemin was cruel and ruthless enough to throw a living, sentient person into the midst of the zombies while he watched them being eaten alive with an impassive expression. However, Shangguan Bingshui was not necessarily inferior to how cruel he was. The people in the room looked at her in different ways, some with fear, some with concern, some with understanding, and various complex emotions. However, Shangguan Bingshui seemed unconcerned by all this and continued to supervise that the survivors did not slack off and work properly while protecting them from danger. Time passed quickly, and on the side where the survivors were working on the beetle's shell and flesh, nothing worth special had happened. Not even a single zombie had appeared in the vicinity as they had all been slaughtered by the main fighters of the group after so many battles and walks back and forth between this area and the gym. At about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the survivors began to slow down the speed at which they were moving their hands, so the work began to fall behind time. Gao Min, Li Na, Fan Wu, sorry to bother you, but could you go call the people who are working? Tell them the food is ready and they can all eat their fill. Wu Yijun noticed the change immediately and asked her friends to take care of informing the 50 survivors who were working. All right. The 3 girls nodded naturally and stood up without hesitation. Now that things had changed, they knew that they needed to at least do simple tasks if they didn't want to be despised by everyone. Wu Yujin herself even went downstairs and headed to the temporary kitchen that had been set up on site to check how the other work was going. There were a group of about 10 female students and teachers, who had temporarily become the group's cooks, were making lunch. I'll go tell Bai Zemin that the food is ready. Shangguan Bingshui walked towards the window as she said, it's been about 7 hours since he's been killing zombies and he probably needs to replenish his energy as well or he won't be able to sustain himself for the rest of the day. Bingshui, Chen, he called out to her and she stopped before looking back with doubtful eyes. What's wrong? Hearing her voice as cold as ice, Chen, he hesitated to say that he would go for her to look for Bai Zemin. In the end, he shook his head and said with a worried look, you. Be careful. Shangguan Bingshui looked at him for a few seconds before turning around and saying in the same voice as always, don't worry. I'm not as weak as I may seem. With nothing more to say and without waiting for a response, she jumped out of the window and floated like a butterfly until her feet touched the ground before her speed burst, disappearing from everyone's sight within seconds. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 72, Completing Initial Evolution Requirements. On the other hand, Bai Zemin spent all morning, noon, and 2 or 3 hours of the afternoon eliminating zombie after zombie without rest. The same was true for Fu Xiefeng, Kai Jingyi, and Zhong De, who were taking care of the opposite flank that he was dealing with. However, while Bai Zemin was doing well due to his high stamina which had reached a horrendous point being his highest body stats, the same could not be said for Kai Jingyi and the other 2. After fighting constantly for several hours, the stamina of the group of 3 could not keep up with their pace as even taking turns and slowing down the charge was difficult for them. Although they had killed a few zombies and had advanced in level to approximately level 8 or 9, mental fatigue was causing everyone's stamina to drop at higher rates than normal. With no other choice, Bai Zemin's 3 subordinates abandoned the separate hunt and walked towards the southeastern area, following the traces of blood and zombie corpses to find him and get some rest as they really needed it, or else they might end up suffering unnecessary injuries or even worse, getting scratched by a zombie and getting infected in the process. After walking and searching for several minutes, the 3 finally felt the sound of several zombies growling as well as the thud of bodies and heads constantly falling to the ground. The 3 looked at each other before rushing forward and after running for 2 blocks and rounding a corner, their footsteps stopped dead in their tracks as they saw the scene before them. Bai Zemin's body was like a leaf swaying in the wind of a raging storm as he ran through a wave of over 500 zombies. For a second he was on one side but in the next instant, his body seemed to become a blur before he appeared in a different place followed by dozens of zombie heads flying through the air. Swoosh. 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 Bang. 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 The sound of the wind being cut in 2 by the blade of the Xinyuan sword as well as the bangs caused by Bai Zemin's kicks connecting against the skulls of the zombies and turning them into minced meat echoed throughout the block and the echo traveled through the nearby buildings. Because Bai Zemin mostly used his sword, few people actually knew the fact that he was actually extremely skilled in all kinds of martial arts, and only Shangguan Bingshui, Liangpeng, and Chen He had seen him in the cafeteria the first day they arrived at the gym. But the reality was that currently, every part of his body was a deadly weapon capable of taking the lives of his enemies in a matter of seconds, and that thanks to his nearly 100 strength points, a kick from him was not something that a normal living being could handle. Under the frightened and shocked gaze of Fu Xiefeng, Kai Jingyi, and Zhong De, the small horde of about 600 zombies was completely decimated and crushed in 5 minutes. In fact, if it were not for the zombies being so crowded together and hindering Bai Zemin's ghostly mobility, the zombies would have been eliminated far quicker as they could not even catch Bai Zemin's shadow and his movements were too explosive since before the zombies could react their heads had already been crushed with a kick or gone flying through the air after a slash from his sword. Phew. Xietain let out a loud and exaggerated exhale as he thought that it would be better not to attract so many zombies in close quarters, as his mobility was greatly affected, and until he could control mana properly and gain some mastery over his blood manipulation skill, his agility was his strongest weapon against numerous but weak enemies. Oh? Xietain turned around and was a bit surprised when he saw the trio standing several meters away. "Guys, what's wrong?" Xietain was the first to react to Xietan's call. She walked forward and began to explain why they had come, being followed closely by Xietain and Xietain. Xietain listened to her words as he casually nodded and told them not to worry too much and congratulated them on their good work. However, his attention was focused on the steps the three of them were taking. Regardless of whether it was Xietain, Xietain, or Xietain, the steps of the three of them were steady, and from the way she spoke without trembling, it seemed that she was not scared or fearful of anything in particular. To many, this might be insignificant, but to Xietain, who had acquired the experience of the best special forces soldiers on Earth, seeing three people who were previously just normal students going through a pool of blood and hundreds of corpses without flinching was something to be praised. If it was in the past, just seeing the bloody scene before them would be enough to scare them to death. Yet here they were, walking among decomposing corpses as if it was no big deal. Of course, Xietain knew that such a thing was possible only because the three of them had been fighting zombies constantly ever since he granted them the opportunity to absorb soul power and opened the gates of evolution for them. Therefore, after killing so many zombies, after seeing so much blood and so many deaths, Xietain and the other two had grown accustomed to the iron smell of blood in the air, and their eyes contained a hint of steadiness that was not present before. Xietain was naturally secretly delighted, as the more prominent they were, the better it would be for his long-term plans. Roar! Suddenly a furious roar echoed through the surroundings, startling the four people present. "Be careful and stay close to me." Xietan's face changed slightly, but Xietan's face and his other two subordinates turned pale, while their legs grew weak, threatening to fall down at any moment. "That's definitely a first-order creature." Lilith, who had been watching from afar in boredom, seemed to perk up a bit as she floated several meters into the sky while looking down. "Xietain, now you'll see that if it's you, the soul record test isn't as impossible as it seems." The scarlet eyes of the beautiful succubus glittered with a hint of anticipation as she observed a shadow move between the buildings in the direction of the group of four. Without hesitation, Xietain activated his blood manipulation skill on himself as he imagined the terrifying scene of his family being killed. Adrenaline was a substance that the body secreted on its own and was not something he himself could control. Therefore, because Xietain was no longer scared of low-level first-order existences, he had no choice but to improvise in order to somehow control how to produce that substance that he so badly needed to fulfill the requirements of evolution and at the same time improve his battle ability for a short period of time. Therefore, although it was unpleasant and he did not even want to think about his family being killed, at this moment they were the only trigger capable of triggering his fears to extreme levels enough to spiral out of control. Fueled by anger and fear, he gritted his teeth as his organism began to secrete large amounts of adrenaline, a substance which was carried at twice the normal speed by the accelerated blood and moving through every part and nerve of his body by the blood vessels that pulsed like the heart of a living being after swelling to match the wild bloodstream. Kill unranked enemies using blood manipulation with a single attack. 100/100. Kill first-order enemy using blood manipulation on yourself. 0/2. Kill first-order enemy with a single attack using blood manipulation on yourself. 0/1. The simplest requirement had already been completed and Xietain was aiming for the second and third. Since in both cases the activation of blood manipulation on himself was required, he did so without hesitation. His pupils became half their normal size, amplifying his range of vision. His body became lighter and more flexible, making it easier for him to move in risky situations. His whole being seemed to be in a strange condition, ready to face any kind of danger that threatened his existence. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 73. First Order is no longer a challenge. Xietain, Xietain, and Xietain had no idea what was happening, but after the previous roar, every cell in their body seemed to have gone crazy as fear had almost completely overwhelmed them. This alone was enough to let them know that whatever roared at that moment was definitely not something they could currently stand against. What the group of 3 did was to approach Xietain and stand only a step or 2 away just behind him as they looked around cautiously, raising their weapons in an effort to make themselves feel better. Unlike them, Xietain seemed much more relaxed. His body was in a calm posture, and even his sword was not on guard to defend against any imminent attack. He just stood there, his tiny pupils absorbing more information about the surroundings than any normal person could imagine. Swoosh! Suddenly there was a minuscule sound of wind. It was as if the wind had been cut by an extremely swift object. Xietain turned his head slightly to the left and caught a glimpse of a silhouette rounding the corner of the nearby building before charging towards the group at surprising speeds. This creature was even faster than the First Order's evolved zombie, and even after absorbing so much soul power and with a speed comparable to that of 12 people, Xietain still could not keep track of the incoming enemy. However, while speed was one of the most powerful weapons in existence, it was not necessarily impossible to fight against. Swoosh! Surprisingly, the unknown First Order creature's first target was not to attack Xietain, but aimed at Zhong De, probably due to the fact that he was the closest to the corner from which the creature appeared. Without moving his head, Xietan's eyes moved to the left, and for less than a split second his cold gaze met a pair of golden eyes filled with murderous intent. Just as the strange creature passed by him, Xietain slashed with his right hand from below upwards as he began to turn his body. The First Order creature quickly realized that if it continued on its current path it would be seriously wounded by the enemy blade, so without hesitation it tilted its body to the side, evading the enemy slash by just a few inches. However, Xietain already expected something like this to happen given the creature's fast movement speed, and his sword movement was just a feint. The real attack was in the turn he had just completed during that small fraction of a second when the creature stopped its movements to avoid being cut. After completing a 90-degree turn, Xietan's body was now right in front of the First Order creature, and because the creature had just twisted its body to dodge his sword, Xietan's leg connected fiercely with the enemy's abdomen. Bang! After being ferociously hit by the 96 strength points that kick contained and not expecting such a thing, the unknown creature was sent flying 10 meters before impacting against the wall of the adjacent building. Hell! Amidst the collapsed rubble, Xietain and his subordinates finally caught a glimpse of the body of a tiger that was over 5 feet tall with grayish-black fur. The beast could not help but raise its head and howl painfully as it squirmed to its feet. Obviously, Xietan's previous kick had caused a fair amount of damage to the mutated tiger's internal organs. Xietain knew that the enemy's speed was faster than his, so he rushed forward like a whirlwind. In less than a second, the short distance of 10 meters was completely closed. Raising the Xianyuan sword, he slashed again at the same time as his body moved strangely. The mutated tiger ignored the pain and jumped to the left, successfully evading the slash. However, before its golden eyes, the elbow of Xietan's left arm grew bigger and bigger until it finally connected against its head. Bang! The tiger's body was buried in the ground next to Xietain at the same time as some bones of the skull cracked due to the blow. However, the First Order creature did not even have time to react to the pain before the next attacks came. Slash! Slash! With 2 clean slashes, the 2 front paws of the mutated tiger were almost completely hacked off. Immediately after, Xietain jumped into the air and positioned himself on top of the tiger's body that was howling in pain. Following this, he stabbed with the tip of the sword and pierced the monster's skull, successfully destroying the brain. However, although it was already dead, the tiger's body was shaking from nerves, and its almost completely severed front paws struck the empty air in front of it. This was precisely the reason why Xietain had positioned himself behind the enemy before killing it, or else he would have been hit and probably injured unnecessarily. You have acquired the soul power of First Order Shadow Tiger level 38. You cannot level up or obtain additional stats before you get the First Order job. A message similar, but at the same time different from the ones he had received in the past, flashed in Xietan's retina. However, he was dumbfounded and paid no attention to it. Is it over? The Shadow Tiger, a creature of First Order and with such a high level, had died just like that? Xietain could not believe it. Not long ago, he had almost been killed by the First Order blazing beetle that was several levels lower than the monster he had just killed so easily. For a moment it was hard for him to adjust to the change. High in the sky, Lilith had a bright smile on her face and her eyes shone like stars in the night sky. "Little Xietain, big sister loves you to death," she whispered to herself. A first-order creature was nothing in Lilith's eyes, and just one look was enough to wipe out an entire army. However, when she was still an unclassified existence, she could not do what Xietain had just done. No, not only she could not, probably no one in all recorded history was ever able to kill an enemy who was in a higher order in less than 3 seconds. Less than 3 seconds. That was the time it took Xietain to end the life of the first-order Shadow Tiger. So, if he really gave it his all and gave up the defense to attack, who said it was impossible to slay a first-order existence with a single attack? Lilith looked forward to it. She looked forward to his growth and couldn't wait to see how far he would go in the future if he didn't fall before he was fully grown. Xietain was the greatest genius she had ever known in her entire life and most likely the greatest in history. However, Lilith had seen countless outstanding geniuses falling from the sky like shooting stars before they were fully grown. Therefore, it was better to be careful because even the biggest ones could fall by a mistake or carelessness. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 74. Now that you mention it. Kai Jingyi, Fu Xiefeng, and Zhong De stood a few feet away with expressions that openly showed how dumbfounded and shocked they were by the way the events unfolded. Seeing Xietain standing over the body of the First-Order Shadow Tiger, none of the three knew how to react to what had just happened. To Kai Jingyi and the rest, the battle between Xietain and the First-Order Shadow Tiger was simply a battle between gods, since from the point of view of the three of them the speed and force displaced by both existences were things they could not comprehend even now that they had become evolved humans. The Shadow Tiger's ghostly speed was undoubtedly astonishing, but what was more astonishing to the three of them had been Xietan's ability to react. He suppressed the Shadow Tiger's speed completely just by relying on 3 factors: reaction ability, strength, battle instinct. Little did they actually know that Xietain had not even given his 100% in the previous battle. Slowly, Xietain climbed down from the corpse of the Shadow Tiger and sighed secretly. Multitasking while he was concentrating on the battlefield and the enemy's movements was really a challenge. If he could get used to his blood manipulation skill and mana, he could not only use the skill on himself, but he could also create weapons to bombard the enemy and restrain them and attack them from inside to outside. Unfortunately, doing such a thing while he was in the middle of a fight was not at all simple and definitely not something that could be learned in a week's time. Forget it, I'll get better at it little by little. My strength and control over blood manipulation have already improved tremendously compared to the first day of the apocalypse. Xietain stopped lamenting and decided to be a bit more optimistic as he made a small but deep cut on the beast's abdomen and began to collect the blood inside. He even emptied some bottles that had blood from normal creatures and exchanged it for the blood of the Shadow Tiger, since although he wasn't sure, Xietain guessed that the blood of a first-order creature should be better than that of an unclassified existence in some manners. While he was on that, he decided to check his 2 most important evolution processes so far. First, his evolution process to First Order. Kill unranked enemies using blood manipulation with a single attack. 100/100. Kill first-order enemy using blood manipulation on yourself. 1/2. Kill first-order enemy with a single attack using blood manipulation on yourself. 0/1. Indeed, he only needed to fulfill 1.5 more requirements to advance successfully. The next thing he decided to check was the progress in the evolution process of his blood manipulation skill. Collect 100 liters of blood from 50 enemies level 5 or higher, 68/100. Collect 10 liters of blood from 5 first-order enemies, 6 out of 10. Collect 1 liter of blood from 1 second-order enemy, 0/1. A week ago, such requirements were far from possible and it seemed that it would take a lifetime to fulfill all of them. However, today, a week later, except for the last requirement, the other 2 were only a matter of time before they were completed. These small details showed Xietain how strong he had become while constantly reminding him that he should not be complacent because somewhere out there were existences capable of wiping out his 20 years of life and effort in a second. After collecting a good amount of blood from the Shadow Tiger, Xietain picked up the 2 orbs from the ground with a complicated look. When he killed the blazing beetle, he acquired a skill scroll and 3 orbs of which one of them was magic grade. After defeating and killing the anti-magic zombie, the beast dropped 3 orbs, and one of them was magic grade as well. But now that he had killed the shadow tiger, he only got 2 orbs, and the highest grade was rare. Slowly and gradually, as he became progressively stronger and capable of defeating first-order existences, the treasures he obtained became less and less in quantity, and the quality also steadily decreased. After holding on to the treasure orbs, Xietain began to search for the mana stone in the head of the shadow tiger. This would be his 5th soul stone in case this monster had one. 1 came from the blazing beetle, 1 from the fast mantis, 2 from 2 of all the mutated dogs he had killed. Xietain had picked them up today while cleaning up the area. Suddenly the sound of footsteps attracted his attention, and he looked back without stopping his movements in search of the soul stone. At a short distance and approaching with regular steps, Shangguan Bingshui was walking through the zombie corpses with an indifferent gaze. The stark contrast between her white dress, silver hair, and her blood-stained surroundings was an exotic sight that could not be appreciated every day. Her attention went between him and the completely lifeless body of the shadow tiger. Her eyes had a strange glint in them, but due to her icy expression, it was hard to tell what was going on in her head. After she reached a few steps away, she stopped and watched his actions silently. Xietan's eyes lit up and his attention was stolen by the hard object he was touching inside the shadow tiger's skull. With a soft tug, he pulled out his blood-covered hand. However, this was ignored by him and he focused on the dark-colored stone in his palm. His mouth curved slightly into a satisfied smile, and he stored his second first-order soul stone in a plastic bag next to the rest. He wasn't worried about separating them, as the difference in size and shape made it too obvious to identify the differences between each grade. "Did something happen?" he asked after he stood up and looked the woman in front of him directly in the eyes with confusion. She stopped looking at the shadow tiger's body and looked at him before slowly explaining, "Lunch was delayed to give the others time to work with the blazing beetle. Currently, the process is going smoothly, but because it's been several hours, the survivors are starting to get hungry, so everyone is preparing to eat now." "I see." He nodded, finally understanding what she meant even if she didn't say it explicitly. "That's okay, thanks for coming all this way to keep me informed." He smiled before turning around and grabbing the shadow tiger corpse by a paw before looking back at her and saying, "Let's go." Shangguan Bingshui looked at his actions and raised an eyebrow. She pointed at the monster's body and asked, "You want to eat that too, eh?" Xietain blinked in surprise and said in a low voice, "My idea was to use this monster's skin as protection at some point, but now that you mention it, I've never tasted the meat of a tiger in my life." Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 75, Successful Experiment. Xietain, Kai Jingyi, Fu Xiefeng, and Zhong De followed Shangguan Bingshui back to the pharmacy building where the group of survivors was. When the group of 5 arrived at the site, there were already many people sitting casually on large rubble rocks eating in wide mouthfuls, and others coming out with their food from inside the building before sitting down and starting to eat just like the rest. Xietain could notice the look of surprise on the students' faces when they saw the black-furred tiger being dragged by him with one hand. "Look, they even hunt a tiger. Isn't it a panther? Idiot, it's obviously a tiger that mutated. Shut up and eat before you have to go back to work." He ignored all this and left the shadow tiger's body near where the blazing beetle was. Currently, the blazing beetle had lost much of its protective shell, and the survivors had also begun cutting up the meat and were packing it in plastic bags to be taken to the refrigerators later. Although it was still uncertain whether the meat was edible or not, as it had not yet been long enough for everyone to feel safe enough, Shangguan Bingshui decided that it was better to work on it beforehand to save time, and, since the survivors were not doing anything productive, her idea was immediately approved by everyone. Xietain received his bowl of rice as well as a large piece of red meat, a smaller piece of white meat, and a steamed bun. After nodding to the people in the kitchen, he simply went to the roof of the building and sat there with the beautiful Lilith a short distance away. However, this did not last long, as Wu Yujin soon appeared on the spot and started chatting with him. As she didn't seem to have any bad intentions, nor did she seem to want to ask him for anything, Xietain casually chatted with her about insignificant things during the slightly late lunch. After finishing his meal, he excused himself and returned to the place where he was before to continue cleaning the area. This time he told Fu Xiefeng and the other 2 that one of them would switch places with Kong Lan and take her to level up. The whole day passed exactly the same way as it started. Xietain cleared small groups and considerably large groups of zombies while practicing his control over mana and adapting to the use of blood manipulation in different circumstances. Slowly but surely he could notice steady improvement in his control over magic as well as imagining and solidifying blood to form spears. When the sun went down, he finally decided to call it a day and returned to the gym, casually meeting up with Chenhe's group and the rest who had returned several minutes earlier. Surprisingly, Shangguan Shue's group had also not been dawdling while the other survivors worked as they had brought even more mattresses and clothes from the female dormitory. Now, thanks to the large movement of female students the day before, practically everyone had a place to lie down to sleep, and while it was not as comfortable as a bed, it was countless times more comfortable than the cold hard ground. Little by little the living conditions of the survivors improved, which made the heavy and gloomy atmosphere slowly lighten thanks to the new comforts as well as the power demonstrated by Xietain and the other evolved ones. From about 7:30 in the morning until now more than 14 hours have passed, but there hasn't been the slightest sign of adverse effect on the three scum who ate the beetle meat. Shangguan Shui was sitting on a chair next to a table inside the cafeteria and began to announce the results of the experiment conducted today. Basically, can meat be eaten or not? Liang Peng asked in confusion. Shangguan Shui looked at him before looking at the rest and continuing, during all this time, if something bad were to happen, at least there should have already been a minor indication. However, there is no change in skin color, no fever, the pupils did not dilate in any way, nor does there seem to be any kind of mental change. I think it is correct to assume that the flesh of mutated monsters is not harmful to the human body. Xietain chuckled and said in a considerably cheerful tone, that means that from today onwards we have another source of food, doesn't it? That's right. Shangguan Shui nodded as she looked at everyone. Even her icy attitude was somewhat warmer at this moment, which proved how cheerful she was. The evolved animals and insects were from a certain point of view more terrifying than the zombies since only one of them could devastate large groups of people in a short time. However, now they had also become an indispensable food source. Xietain and the rest still didn't know how the mana had affected the land of the world in general, but Lilith had told him that it was possible for the crops to stop growing as it was not something strange by any means. Therefore, if that happened, every meal they consumed was one less meal that could not be replenished. With the current situation in the world, the production factories would naturally cease to function, so they could not count on that kind of food either. Therefore, the most natural food was the meat of other species. Now that it had been confirmed that the meat of the first-order blazing beetle was edible, the joy and relief they felt was simply too great as a heavy burden had been lifted from their shoulders. Without food people would not be willing to work, would not obey, and chaos would soon break out everywhere, which considering the current situation of the world would mean the destruction of the human race. But now that they knew they could get a safe food source from other animals, the problem had at least been alleviated a little more, and while it was not a long-term solution, at least for the moment it was better than nothing. By the way, what happened to those three guys? Xietain asked casually. As promised, I let them go. Shangguan Shui replied indifferently. Xietain looked at her and asked in a strange tone. They left at this time? That's right. Any problem? She looked at him and asked in confusion, any problem? Xietain didn't know what to say, so he simply shook his head as he sneered at the three poor pitiful guys. While it was true that he had cleared the southeast of the northern area and his three subordinates had partially cleared the southwest area, at night the dangers abounded much more. Xietain knew that three normal people without even the courage to fight would definitely not be able to survive during the night unless they were lucky. But even if they survived the night danger, considering that there was no food around, it was only a matter of time before they died in one way or another. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 76 Buses. Today, Xietain had also made sure that Kong Lan spent the 2 daily activations of her lesser healing skill on his left hand, and although she had again exhausted almost all of her mana, the results were as surprising as the first time since his wrist had recovered between 80% and 90%, which meant that he only needed to be treated for 1 or 2 more days before fully recovering. Less than a week to recover from such a serious bone fracture. In the previous world, such a thing was simply unthinkable even with the most advanced medical treatments. But now, thanks to Bai Zemin's constant evolution, Kong Lan's high magical power and her lesser healing skill, it was something that was happening before everyone's eyes. After a sleepless night, there was still a lot of work to do, so everyone woke up very early in the morning as soon as the first ray of sunlight came out. Just like the day before, after breakfast, the group of evolved fighters split into two. One group led survivors to work with the flesh of the blazing beetle, and the other smaller group began to clear out the larger zombie waves, blocking the way to the exit. The only difference was that this time the formation of the groups was different. The day before, because they were still unsure of the effect of the mutated insect meat, Shangguan Bing Shui, who was the person who had come up with the idea of eating it and conducting an experiment, had to be present all day. However, now that the doubts had been cleared up and they finally realized that the area around the pharmacy building was relatively safe, there was no longer any need for such protection. Therefore, Shangguan Bing Shui had also begun to clear the road leading to the parking lot where the school buses and other cars that in the past belonged to students or teachers were located. After a full day, the group went back to rest, and when they woke up the next day, they split up again to continue working. 10th day since the arrival of the soul record on Earth. After a little more than 3 days of cleanup, Shangguan Bing Shui, Fu Xiefeng, Kai Jingyi, and Zhong De had finally wiped out all the zombies in the southwestern area north of the university. Moreover, after being constantly healed by Kong Lan and thanks to his high health, Bai Zemin's broken hand had finally recovered completely, and he could move it so normally that no one would believe him if he said that a week ago his bones had almost turned to dust. Oh! This will make the trip so much easier. Chen, he exclaimed happily as he looked at the more than 10 buses and hundreds of cars neatly parked. Because the parking lot was underground, the zombies in this place were very few, and after some easy work, the area was cleared. If it weren't for the lack of amenities that prevented a human being from wanting to live here, this place could be considered the most suitable in the entire university. In fact, this solves a big problem. Bai Zemin nodded in agreement and sighed with secret relief. In order for his long-term plans to work properly, Bai Zemin needed help from other people. Besides, if he didn't help human beings whenever possible, then who was going to run the factories, water dams, and power plants as well as many other systems when the world recovered? He couldn't do that. Therefore, even if the safety of other people was not especially his concern, it was a task he had to accomplish. So far, the group of survivors rescued by Bai Zemin and the rest numbered around 500 or 600. However, getting them all out of the university would be too great a challenge. But with the addition of this fleet of buses, this problem had been almost completely solved. Hey guys, bring those things and the tools. Liang Peng waved his hand and shouted toward the other corner. His loud voice echoed everywhere, and if there was a zombie hiding, it would undoubtedly have been attracted. Under his call, a large group of men dragged several metal pieces over a meter long that contained other smaller metal pieces inside. These metal pieces were, naturally, the shell of the first-order blazing beetle. After several days of work and effort, the more than 3 meters tall and more than 5 meters in length of the beetle had completely disappeared. Its flesh was being properly preserved, the shell had been saved, and even the large legs had been taken to the gymnasium to be turned into weapons later. As for the meat, everyone was surprised the first time they tasted it. The mutated elephant beetle meat was not only delicious and tender, but when they consumed it, everyone received some stat points, increasing their natural health by a couple of points. Even Bai Zemin received 1 health point back then. Although it was a pity that it only worked once, as they ate more of that meat a normal person's body would become much healthier naturally, which was amazing. Seeing the amount of shell parts, Bai Zemin stretched his body and his bones thundered as he said, "All right, time to start working." More than 20 male students nodded and began to inspect the buses together with Liang Peng and Bai Zemin. This group consisted of people with some experience in mechanics, and all of them came from working backgrounds. "I think we should remove the front bumper, which is practically plastic, and exchange it for a metal one." "No, why don't we better create a pointed platform that covers the front and leave just the front window uncovered? But that would waste too much material, and I'm not sure it would be enough with the shell we have now." MMH. That's true. Not only that, the gears could come loose if we take the whole carcass apart. This, as he looked at Bai Zemin and Liang Peng fervently arguing with the other male students and naming words unknown to him, Chen he couldn't help but feel uncomfortable. Before the world suddenly changed, Chen He was a model student who aimed to become someone important in the government in the future. In addition, because his family had enough money, he also didn't need to get a job, so he didn't have any knowledge about mechanics or automobiles. In the past, he drove a car that cost over 2 million Chinese yuan, and if it needed to be repaired, Chen He would take it to the best service. How could he understand what they were talking about then? In China, a mechanic was a job generally chosen by unschooled people, and people generally did not look favorably on them. However, in this new world, knowledge of mechanics was countless times more valuable than the political knowledge Chen He had acquired. What was previously viewed with somewhat disdainful eyes was now needed and praised, while what was once praised and a symbol of pride was now useless. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 77 Modification completed in Troubles. Wu Yujin seemed to be able to understand the thoughts of her childhood friend, but in this case, there were no words that could lift anyone's spirits. After all, Chen He had always been outstanding in everything, and now that he was completely overshadowed, naturally it was too abrupt a change for him, and it would take time for him to get used to it. In fact, many of the girls who previously seemed to have some sort of feeling or admiration for him could not help but look at him again and compare him with Bai Zemin unconsciously. If it were 10 days ago, Bai Zemin would not even be worthy of a second look from the several beautiful women among the survivors, but now everything was different. Many could not help but wonder, in a world where death is as natural as breathing, is it better to pursue a handsome man or a man of greater capability? Chen He was, of course, skilled. It was just that Bai Zemin was too overpowered. I'll go scout the exit path to the south, Chen He said before turning around and leaving the scene, deciding that it was better to do what he asked to do. He too had his own strengths, and it was better to appreciate them rather than demean himself. Time passed quickly, the morning was over and the afternoon was half over, but the sound of hammering, drilling, grinding, welding, as well as the sound of wheel nuts and screws falling to the ground could be heard everywhere in the university's subway parking lot. The group of about 22 people worked almost without rest and only stopped to eat when they were hungry, because the sooner they finished the job, the sooner they could leave the university grounds and finally get to know what the situation was like in the outside world. Apart from the 22 experienced in mechanics, there were also many more people helping to hold the metal parts in place or reaching for the objects and tools pointed out by any of them, which sped up the work process a lot more. One thing worth noting was that when they started working, Bai Zemin, Liang Peng, and the other 20 students received the following message, but with some differences. In the case of Bai Zemin in particular, it was this: you have learned the unclassified passive skill repair level 5. The soul record was an unknown entity that recorded all the experiences in the soul of each existence and converted it into statistics and skills capable of being evolved and studied in greater depth. Therefore, as people with experience in the field of mechanics, they naturally acquired a corresponding skill. Something similar had happened with the female students and male students who had helped in the kitchen. They acquired the passive skill cooking, and the level of the skill depended on the personal ability of each of them. The amazing thing about the soul record was that each person's ability could grow much faster compared to the past thanks to the existence of mana. The more they cooked, the more the cooking skill of those in charge of the kitchen grew steadily, and the more they hammered, the more the repair skill level of those they were modifying increased. This was another wonder of this strange unknown entity known as the soul record. The appearance of the current buses was quite different when compared to the classic buses that were parked several hours ago. In the past, the vehicles were much safer from a certain point of view as they were made of almost pure iron, while today's vehicles were made mainly of plastic and even fiberglass in some cases, which improved the appearance and comfort. Therefore, to better adapt to this new world and to everyone's needs, the front part of the buses had been almost completely removed and replaced by a large metal plate that left only the window and the headlights uncovered. In addition, all the other glass windows of the buses had been removed and replaced with a blazing beetle shell plate on each side. Although it was a pity that most of the metal hard shell had been used, the overall security of the 10 buses had taken a tremendous leap forward compared to the previous ones. Finally done. Bai Zemin looked at their work with a touch of satisfaction. Even though they didn't have all the necessary tools, it had turned out really well, and the 10 luxurious-looking buses now looked like 10 steel monsters. Good job. Wu Yujin approached with a small bottle of water and handed it to him with a charming smile. Thank you. He thanked her and smiled politely back before he began to survey the surroundings as he sipped water slowly. Bai Zemin saw that it wasn't just Wu Yujin, Gao Min, Li Na, Fan Wu, and many other students were handing out small closed bottles of water to each of those who helped modify the buses. At this point, everyone knew that they had to help in any way they could, not only to exponentially increase their chances of survival and improve their lives, but also not to be expelled from the group. Even those who were unwilling to leave the safety of the enclosed places worked as long as it wasn't something that required going out in the open. Now we can finally get out of here. Shangguan Bingshue's voice sounded from behind, and when Bai Zemin turned around he saw her slowly approaching as she looked at the buses before looking back at him. Good job. Although her voice was cold, at least she sounded sincere, and it would be a lie to say that Bai Zemin wasn't secretly surprised. This was the first time he had heard her say small words of praise, or at least towards him. While it wasn't much, it was a breakthrough as a group. It was what Bai Zemin believed. Yeah. He replied briefly, and before the conversation had a chance to progress, a roar from outside silenced all sound underground. Roar. Not good. One of the survivors in charge of standing guard near the entrance shouted in fright, Chen He is fighting an ape over 10 feet tall. They are currently heading this way. Hearing the students scream of terror and remembering the earlier roar, the survivors' faces turned pale as a sheet and they quickly ran to the back and deeper part of the subway. Some of them fell to the ground and a few were even stomped by those behind, being seriously injured and even dying in the process. After all, a stampede of over 500 people was no joke, and most of them had thought that Chen He was an invincible existence, but since an ape forced him to retreat to this place it meant that he was weaker, which made the survivors think that they were going to die. Liang Peng, Fu Xiefeng, Kai Jingyi, Zhong De, and Kong Lan quickly began to help those who could help and to beat up those who became disobedient or wanted to incite chaos in any way. This had been one of the rules and ideas that had been put forward not many days ago, and for the first time it was being implemented to avoid major panic. An ape of more than 10 feet? Chen He? First order. Bai Zemin's mind flashed with that thought, and only now did he realize that the handsome archer was nowhere to be seen. Whoosh! Before he moved, a breeze rushed beside him, and the next thing Bai Zemin saw was Shangguan Bingshue dashing at full speed to the exit. Her speed was at least 8 or 9 times faster than a normal person before the apocalypse, which meant that her agility stat was at least between 80 and 90 points. Although he was surprised, he also charged towards the exit. Like Shangguan Bingshue, Bai Zemin was clear that it was absolutely impossible for Chen He to cope with a first-order existence on his own. Although the archer had become more powerful after absorbing some of the first-order anti-magic zombie soul power and defeating other enemies over the past few days, it was still not enough for him to survive against such a confrontation. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 78 Absolute Regeneration. The sound of roars and bangs was the first thing Bai Zemin could make out as he approached the exit of the subway parking structure. Furthermore, although it was barely distinguishable due to the overwhelming sound of what he assumed were the mutated ape's attacks, Bai Zemin could also faintly feel the sound of the wind being pierced by what he thought were Chen He's arrows. A split second later, Shangguan Bingshue's cold voice reached his ears, followed by a roar from the mutated ape. Obviously, her attack had managed to inflict enough damage for its roar to change. 2 seconds later, Bai Zemin finally reached the surface and his footsteps paused for a moment to take in the surrounding situation. After all, he didn't want to die shamefully by rushing into battle without knowing what exactly was going on. The first thing that came into his line of sight was an ape that was clearly taller than the previous survivor had announced. Instead of 3 meters tall, the mutated ape easily reached 4 meters, and its muscles were explosive enough to crush a house with its fists. In addition, the mutated beast was covered in a large amount of silver-colored fur that glistened in the rays of the evening sunlight, giving it a majestic appearance. However, the ape's body was wounded. There were at least a dozen arrows firmly stuck in the beast's abdomen, chest, arms, shoulders, and legs, causing blood to flow constantly from those small holes. Bai Zemin narrowed his eyes and noticed that those arrows were not normal. A faint light of light blue shone on the outline of the arrow, which kept them steady and undestroyed by the fierce movements of the mutated ape. It must be the treasure Chen He obtained. Probably something that boosts his attacks in some way. Xietain thought as his sight moved at lightning speed to the semi-frozen limbs of the giant ape. Bang! The giant ape brutally slammed the floor right in front of him and Chen. He hurriedly jumped to the side, almost getting crushed in the process. He stood up instantly after and ran several meters before pulling out an arrow from the quiver behind his back and firing it at full speed. When the arrow touched the bow, its dark brown color turned the same as the other arrows that were stuck in the mutated ape's body, confirming Xiein's theory about boosting power. As for whether it was a treasure or a skill, he didn't know. Freeze. Shangguan Bingshui's voice attracted his attention and Xieitain arrived just in time to see a small golden-colored stick shooting out a blast of icy air. Roar. The ape roared and its wild movements slowed a little but still noticeably. Around its fur, Xieitain could see from a distance how some parts had frozen or were still in the process of freezing due to the icy air from before. A magic wand? Xieitain had that idea as he looked at the small stick in Shangguan Bingshui's hands. He assumed that instead of increasing strength like his Xianyuan sword, the magic wand should definitely increase magic and mana or one of both stats. Instead of interrupting, Xieitain watched the battle unfold as he also wanted to see how strong Chen He and Shangguan Bingshui had become over the past few days. The battle was quite close. The giant ape was pretty fast and seemed to be completely focused on hunting Chen He, who was shooting arrows every time the opportunity presented to him instead of going after Shangguan Bingshui, who was the person that really threatened its life. Bang! 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 Several one- or two-story buildings in the surrounding area were crushed under the giant ape's heavy and powerful fists or its agile kicks that seemed to contain the flexibility and speed of a whip but the power of a giant mace. Xieitain was sure that even he would be seriously injured if he received one of those blows directly. Chen He might not be able to compare with Xieitain, but he was certainly not weak by any means. The damage from his strange arrows was little but slowly accumulated and the giant ape was losing more and more blood. Moreover, when it seemed that he was about to be crushed, he somehow managed to escape at the last second by using the terrain to his advantage. Of course, the reason why Chen He could stand his ground and fight without having to run away as he did before or without being killed was all thanks to Shangguan Bingshui's timely support. Otherwise, he would definitely not be able to do as much against the giant ape, considering that he was currently already at his limit even with support. The giant ape's movements had slowed down by at least 60% and great parts of its body had been frozen with small icicles of ice. In addition, Shangguan Bingshui occasionally set up small ice traps to restrain the monster or shot sharp ice pikes, creating small wounds and freezing the blood inside little by little. Unfortunately, Xieitain knew that it was not so simple to end the life of a first-order existence. Because the giant ape had yet to show any skills. Indeed, Xiein's thoughts proved to be true not long after. Roar. The ape stopped its movements and raised its head to the sky as it roared fiercely. Its silver fur that had been soiled with its own blood and the areas frozen by Shangguan Bingshui's magic spells were surrounded by a strange white light that flashed with such fervor that it seemed to want to compete against the sun, forcing anyone who looked directly at it to close their eyes. When the bright flash calmed down and everyone was able to open their eyes again, Chen He could not help but take several steps back as Shangguan Bingshui's eyes widened slightly in disbelief. I see. So that's the skill this ape obtained when it advanced to first order. Xieitain muttered to himself and couldn't help but secretly feel a bit of fear as he realized what the giant ape's skill was. The giant ape's skill was very simple. It didn't increase its strength, nor did it increase its speed or defense, nor did it give it any kind of elemental control. It was a skill that could only be used on itself. Regeneration. The skill that the giant mutated ape had acquired during its evolution gave it the ability to recover from seemingly any wound. What was worse than a strong enemy? A strong enemy that could recover from the wounds you had inflicted on it after working so hard and risking your life so many times to do so. The silver fur that was covered with blood and ice patches now looked perfect as if it had never faced any enemy in the first place. However, Xieitain noticed that the beast was breathing erratically and the madness in its eyes seemed to have dimmed, being replaced by tiredness. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 79, Becoming Stronger. Xieitain Although the active skill of the giant mutated ape was undoubtedly powerful to the point that it could make an enemy despair after a close and hard battle, it was also a skill that consumed a great deal of mana and probably stamina as well. At least this was the conclusion to which Xietain himself had come to after studying every sign shown by the beast after the activation of the skill. The monster's body was no longer firmly standing, its limbs trembled slightly, its breathing was agitated to the point where steam was coming out of its nostrils, etc. These were all signs of exhaustion, however. Xietain narrowed his eyes and realized that he only had about 3 or 4 arrows in his quiver, which meant that he could no longer continue fighting. Furthermore, Shangguan Bingshui herself had exhausted quite a bit of mana, and although she could still stay in battle, her chest was also rising and falling somewhat erratically with each of her breaths. Although they could not defeat the mutated giant ape, if it were another beast the odds of being victorious would probably be higher or lower depending on the type of enemy and its skill. The problem with first-order creatures was that you never knew what you were going to face until you faced it. The giant ape suddenly turned and began to run south. Considering its height and its human-like and even more flexible mobility, it was only a matter of time before it disappeared from everyone's sight. Shangguan Bingshui's face turned ugly as she saw her prey about to flee. She had expended 70% to 80% of her mana, but she was confident of overcoming. However, if the giant mutated ape wanted to flee, she had no confidence in being able to stop it. Chains. An indifferent voice sounded from the back, near the entrance to the subway parking area. Chen He and Shangguan Bingshui did not need to turn around to know who the owner of that voice was after having lived and spent so much time together for almost half a month. Whoosh. 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 Suddenly, the blood that the giant mutated ape had lost during the battle moved strangely, and as if they were snakes with a will of their own, they rose from the ground and began to surround the beast's limbs. 2 red chains that glowed like rubies coiled tightly around the upper limbs, while 4 chains clung tightly around the lower limbs of the giant mutated ape, sealing its movements. Roar. The beast looked towards the source of mana's movement required for magical activation and roared with bloodshot eyes as it struggled with all its strength, causing the blood chains to begin cracking violently. However, the current Xietain was no longer the same Xietain from before, who barely had any knowledge about mana and his skill. Reinforce. Xietain muttered under his breath, and the blood on the ground merged with the already formed bloody chains, repairing the cracks and making them stronger. For the past few days, Xietain had been practicing control over mana and his blood manipulation practically non-stop, only stopping to sleep and to eat his daily meals. The rest of the time was spent by him using zombies as a source of training. At first, it was difficult and extremely frustrating to see how his efforts were worthless. Then, he couldn't help but think in Shangguan Bingshui and noticed that every time she created something out of ice, she would say the name of her creation out loud, or when she sent the ice bullets flying, she would wave her hand. It was then that an idea flashed in his mind and, copying her ways, he began to train by saying the name of what he was imagining every time he used his blood manipulation skill. In doing so, Xietain was pleasantly surprised to realize how much easier it made his task, as he could divert more of his focus to the mana within his body to resonate with that of his surroundings, and the activation of his skill consumed significantly less effort and mana than normal. After approximately 3 days of virtually non-stop training, the fruits of his efforts began to slowly manifest, and at this point he was shining. Seeing Shangguan Bingshui and Chen He fighting, Xietain realized that both of them, especially her, were strong to the point of being geniuses. But in fact, the difference with him was still quite large. With such a difference in power, there was no need to hide his power so much, and the more he showed the better it would be, as the less they would dare to plan against him in the future. He threw a bottle of blood into the air and stretched his hand upward as he slowly said, "Spear." Bang! The bottle exploded and the liquid blood was surrounded by a wave of mana. In less than a second, the blood coalesced and hardened, taking the shape of a firm, pointed spear over 2 meters long. This spear even had a faint red glow around it, since he had consumed over 80 mana points to make it. One could imagine the hidden power of the weapon. When the blood spear fell into his hands after descending, Xietain brought his right hand with the spear as far back as possible just above his shoulder, and with his left foot he took a big step forward, turning his body 360 degrees, and after finishing the turn the spear shot forward at full speed. However, before the spear completely left his hand, the blazing ring in his right hand flashed and a crimson flame covered the spear in its entirety. Boom! With almost 100 strength points and having expended almost the same amount of mana, the spear created with the Shadow Tiger's blood raised a small boom as it went beyond what the surrounding air pressure was able to withstand. A crimson line filled with burning heat closed the distance in a second, and before the giant ape could react, the spear had firmly penetrated its head. But that was not all. Boom! The spear filled with fire-like energy blasted, and the beast's head exploded into countless pieces. The pieces of burnt flesh and the smell of blood floated in the air. The blood chains holding the beast upright vanished, and the practically headless body fell noisily to the ground, collapsing onto a pile of rubble and raising a cloud of dust in the process. Chen-He's eyes and mouth were wide open comically, and the disbelief in his gaze expressed how great was the shock he had received. Tap. 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 Shangguan Bingshui turned her head slightly towards the source of the sound of light footsteps, and her blue eyes shivered for a moment as she saw the relaxed smile on the face of the young man behind her. Bai Zemin had a casual smile and even rested his free hand comfortably inside his pants pocket as if what he had just done was no big deal. He became stronger in this week. Was the thought of Shangguan Bingshui and Chen-He as they recalled what they had just witnessed, both feeling complicated emotions. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 80 Critical Hit. Indeed, Bai Zemin had become stronger than he was several days ago. His physical or magical stats had not changed in any way, and he had not leveled up either since he was currently in a vortex, which once completely overcome he could evolve into a more powerful existence, but in the meantime, he could not acquire any power boosts. In fact, he had not even used his available status points in any way to boost his natural stats. However, in this world there were many ways to become stronger without leveling up, without acquiring soul power or stats, even without treasures or obtaining skill scrolls. One of those ways was to learn and use what one already had in the most optimal way possible. Bai Zemin was training precisely to become stronger in this way, and although he still had a long way to go, it was undoubtedly a breakthrough compared to the past. In addition, Bai Zemin had also been practicing other types of attacks using the skills he had along with his treasures, creating amazing effects. In fact, the previous attack was just an improvised blazing blood spear. But he had planned something much more powerful by making use of those two skills and adding something else as an intensifier. You have acquired the soul power of First Order Platinum Ape level 37. You cannot level up or obtain additional stats before you get the First Order job. You have learned unclassified passive skill level 5, throwing. 3 glowing orbs filled with soul power came out of the lifeless body of the First Order Platinum Ape and went into the bodies of Bai Zemin, Shangguan Bingshui, and Chen-He respectively, the size of the orbs being quite similar to each other with barely any almost indistinguishable difference. In addition, another message flashed in Bai Zemin's retina. Although he was somewhat surprised, the surprise was not that great since he had somehow expected something like this to happen. The reason? Of course, the beautiful and seductive Lilith. She had explained to him more about the world of skills, and thanks to that now Bai Zemin's knowledge had increased as a consequence. A person could not only learn skills by training but could also learn through skill scrolls after defeating enemies, and skills could evolve. However, there were exceptions to this rule. Ignoring the world around him, Bai Zemin took a look at the new skill as this was something he was looking forward to because this skill would be of great help for his evolution to First Order. Throwing, unclassified passive skill, level 5. When throwing an object with your bare hands, you have a 20% probability of dealing a critical hit to the enemy. This skill has reached its maximum point and cannot evolve on its own. To some extent, it was also something that he already expected. However, the impossibility of evolving alone was something that surprised him, and now he finally understood several things that Lilith had explained to him about the soul record and the skills. Apart from the individual stats, there were also other stats that were not displayed in the window of each person or intelligent creature. An example of this was the critical hit statistic, defense, attack damage, etc. To acquire these stats, one needed to obtain certain skills or certain items that were usually not formed after the defeat of an enemy and the intervention of the soul record in the soul power of the loser. For example, a blacksmith or artifact maker could create weapons, armor, accessories, which increased physical damage or defense but did not increase stats such as strength or stamina and health that treasures created from soul power could increase. Lilith said that the higher existences referred to these statistics as tracking statistics as they could only constantly track these statistics by looking at one's skills and equipment. This was precisely the reason why such jobs or classes were considered a rarity and prized on all worlds, since the soul record was a righteous entity that allowed anyone who had talent and used it in the right way and with the right materials to become powerful. Even someone who did not have the courage to fight powerful enemies could become empowered as long as they knew or possessed a class of artifact crafting or blacksmithing and similar. Xietain sighed as he realized how many things he had yet to know and how many other things he had yet to come into contact with. Although he might seem extremely strong, even though it was true that Lilith's advance information was very helpful to him, the reality was that all this also had a counterproductive side effect, and that was that he started to realize early on that what weighed on his shoulders was bigger and bigger than he had imagined at the beginning. Xietain, are you okay, Em? Xietain snapped out of his daze and looked back with a casual smile. Why wouldn't I be? I didn't even face that ape head-on, and all I did was deal the final strike. Is that so? Shangguan Bingshui furrowed her eyebrows slightly before nodding. If you say so. For a moment she had seemed to see him depressed, which had struck her as peculiar considering the overwhelming strength he had just demonstrated and how easily he had claimed the life of the First Order Platinum Ape, even if it was true that the beast had been largely exhausted by her and Chen He previously. A First Order existence was still a First Order existence, tired or not. But she soon rejected that thought after hearing his reply and took it as a wrong thought of hers. Xietain bent down and picked up the 3 objects dropped by the Platinum Ape. Surprisingly, the First Order beast had dropped 3 items, a skill scroll, a red orb, and an orange orb. Chen He, is it okay if we divide these 3 treasures and then tell us what happened? Yes. Chen He nodded with a serious expression and said in a deep voice, leaving the university might be more difficult than we thought, and those 3 treasures, regardless of how weak they are, we will certainly need them. Xietain and Shangguan Bingshui looked at each other for a moment before looking back at Chen He with a frown. Apparently, things were much more complex than they had previously expected. A normal treasure, a rare treasure, and a skill scroll. Let's see what kind of skill it is. Xietain put the victory loot on a large pile of rubble that had collapsed and grabbed the skill scroll to see what skill it was before passing it to the rest. Regeneration, First Order active skill, level 5, regenerates stamina according to the mana consumed. Every 2 mana points regain 1 stamina point. Xietain couldn't help but frown hard at the sight of the skill that had formed after the sublimation of the Platinum Ape's remaining soul power. This was something he definitely did not expect, and honestly, the skill looked quite weak compared to his blood manipulation, even though they were skills of the same level and order. Flash. Flash. After 2 small squeezes, the 2 orbs burst into flashes of orange and red light before 2 new objects appeared on the pile of rubble.